Sleep History of Coffee: How a Bean Awoke the World. A YouTube video essay script. There's a moment just before dawn when the world exists in two states at once. Night hasn't quite surrendered, day hasn't fully arrived, and somewhere in that liminal space, a kettle begins to whistle. You know this moment. We all do. It's the pause before consciousness fully returns, when your hand reaches automatically for a handle, a switch, a familiar ritual that promises to translate you from one realm to another, from sleep to wakefulness, from potential to presence. But here's what's strange. For most of human history, this moment didn't exist. Not like this. Not with this particular alchemy of water, heat, and ground seeds that we've come to depend on so completely that we barely question it anymore. Think about it. Somewhere in the architecture of your daily life, probably within the first 30 minutes of opening your eyes, you perform a ceremony. You might call it making coffee. But what you're really doing is activating a chain of events that connects you to a story that spans continents, centuries, and the very nature of human consciousness itself. How did we get here? How did a bitter seed from a shrub in the Ethiopian highlands become the second most traded commodity on Earth? How did a simple plant become synonymous with thinking, working, creating, and being awake to the world? This isn't just a history of a beverage. It's the story of how humanity learned to cheat sleep, accelerate thought, and ultimately transform the rhythm of civilization itself. It's about the moment we discovered we could borrow energy from nature, bottle it, and use it to remake ourselves. And it all started with a goat, or at least, that's how the legend goes. In the Ethiopian highlands, sometime in the 9th century, or maybe the 6th, or possibly even earlier, because origin stories have a way of blurring at their edges, there lived a goat herd named Kaldi. History doesn't tell us much about Kaldi. We don't know if he was young or old, patient or restless, content with his life or dreaming of something more. But we know this: he noticed something. His goats were acting strange. Now, if you know goats, you know they're already fairly strange to begin with. They eat things they shouldn't. They climb things that shouldn't be climbed. They have a kind of chaotic energy that makes you wonder if they're operating on a different frequency than other animals. But this was different. His goats weren't just energetic, they were dancing. Not metaphorically, actually dancing, leaping, spinning, possessed by an enthusiasm that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. And Kaldi, being the kind of person who pays attention to things, followed their path backward. Where had they been? What had they eaten? The trail led to a shrub with bright red berries. Cherries, technically, though no one was calling them that yet. Inside each cherry, 2 seeds, pale green and unassuming. The goats had been eating them, and whatever was in those seeds was coursing through their bloodstream, translating chemical potential into pure kinetic joy. Kaldi, displaying either remarkable curiosity or questionable judgment, decided to try them himself. The stories diverge here. Some say he ate the cherries raw and felt a surge of clarity unlike anything he'd experienced. Others say he brought them to monks at a nearby monastery who experimented with them in various ways, first eating them, then boiling them, eventually discovering that roasting them produced an aroma that seemed to contain all the mysteries of wakefulness itself. What matters isn't whether Kaldi existed. What matters is what the story tells us about how humans relate to discovery. We noticed something, we paid attention, we experimented, and in doing so, we stumbled onto a technology that would eventually reshape human consciousness. Because that's what coffee is, really, a technology. Not in the sense of circuits and screens, but in the older sense, a tool that extends human capability. Fire extended our teeth and stomachs, clothing extended our skin, and coffee extended our waking hours. It gave us more time to be conscious, to think, to create, to conspire and dream and build. But in those early days, in the forests and mountains where coffee grew wild, no one was thinking about global trade or industrial revolutions. The first people to use coffee were simply trying to stay awake long enough to talk to God. The Sufi mystics of Yemen discovered something that monks and spiritual seekers throughout history have always known. Consciousness is difficult. Staying present, truly present, requires enormous energy. The mind wanders, the body gets tired. You sit down to pray or meditate or contemplate the divine, and before you know it, you're asleep. Coffee solved this problem. By the 15th century, the Sufis were cultivating coffee plants in Yemen, particularly in the mountains around Mocha. They called the drink kahwa, which some say comes from a word meaning to lack hunger, or possibly from a word meaning wine. The etymology is uncertain, but the meaning was clear. This was a substance that altered consciousness, that made the invisible more visible, that kept the gates of awareness open when they wanted to close. The Sufis would gather at night for dhikr, their devotional practice of rhythmic chanting and prayer. Hours would pass, the darkness would deepen, and coffee would keep them tethered to the world, alert enough to pursue the transcendent. There's something beautiful about this, isn't there? The idea that one of humanity's first uses for caffeine was spiritual, not productive in the modern sense, not efficient, just awake, present, conscious enough to reach for something beyond consciousness. Word spread through the Islamic world. Coffee moved from Sufi monasteries to the general population. It traveled with traders and pilgrims from Yemen to Mecca, from Mecca to Cairo, from Cairo to Istanbul. And wherever it went, it created a new kind of social space, the coffee house. Before coffee houses, there were taverns, there were marketplaces, there were mosques and churches and temples where people gathered. But the coffee house was different. It was a place designed around conversation, around being awake together, around the exchange of ideas, rather than the exchange of prayers or goods, though plenty of both happened there too. The first coffee houses appeared in Mecca and Istanbul in the early 16th century. They were called kahve khane, and they were almost immediately controversial. Think about what a coffee house represented. It was a place where anyone, theoretically, could come and sit and talk, not just about trade or family or the mundane business of daily life, but about ideas, philosophy, politics, poetry. The kind of talk that happens when people aren't dulled by alcohol, but aren't quite their normal, cautious selves either. They're caffeinated, alert, emboldened. Religious authorities didn't know what to make of this. Was coffee permissible under Islamic law? It altered consciousness, which was suspicious. It created gathering places outside of religious control, which was troubling. In 1511, the governor of Mecca tried to ban coffee, claiming it led to subversive political discussions. The ban lasted about 15 minutes, historically speaking. Coffee had already become too embedded in daily life to be extracted. Similar attempts were made in Cairo, in Istanbul, in various cities across the Ottoman Empire. Coffee was banned, then unbanned, then banned again, in a cycle that would repeat throughout history whenever authorities felt nervous about what happens when people gather to think and talk while fully awake. But the coffee houses persisted. They became known as schools of the wise, places where chess was played, poetry was recited, music was performed, and news was exchanged. They were libraries without books, universities without credentials, parliaments without formal power, but with enormous informal influence. By the time coffee reached Europe in the 17th century, it carried with it not just a beverage, but an entire social technology. The idea that consciousness could be a collective state, that wakefulness could be shared, that thinking could be a social activity rather than a solitary one. Europe was about to find out what happens when an entire civilization gets caffeinated. Coffee arrived in Venice first, as most things did. Venice in the 17th century was the hinge between East and West, the port where ships brought spices, silks, stories, and eventually coffee. The Venetian merchants who first tasted it found it bitter, strange, vaguely medicinal. Some called it the bitter invention of Satan. The Catholic Church had to officially weigh in. Pope Clement VIII was asked to denounce coffee as a Muslim beverage, unsuitable for Christians. But the Pope, displaying either wisdom or good taste, tried it first. His response, supposedly, "This devil's drink is so delicious, we should cheat the devil by baptizing it." Whether or not he actually said this, the sentiment captured something important. Coffee was too good, too useful, too transformative to reject on ideological grounds. And so it spread from Venice to the rest of Italy, from Italy to the rest of Europe, carrying with it the coffeehouse model that had evolved in Istanbul. London's first coffee house opened in 1652. Within 50 years, there were more than 3,000 of them. They were called penny universities because for the price of a penny, the cost of a cup of coffee, you could sit and listen to discussions ranging from science to philosophy to the latest political scandal. Samuel Pepys gossiped in them. Isaac Newton debated in them. The entire infrastructure of modern British commerce, the stock exchange, insurance companies, shipping registers, emerged from conversations held in coffee-soaked rooms where men gathered to be alert together. The coffee houses had rules, often posted on the walls. No quarreling, no gambling, no obscenity. But the real rule, the unspoken one, was this. When you entered a coffee house, your ideas mattered more than your status. A merchant could debate a nobleman. A poet could challenge a politician. The hierarchy of sleep, where everyone knew their place and stayed in it, gave way to the democracy of wakefulness. Charles II tried to ban coffee houses in 1675, claiming they were breeding grounds for dissent and rebellion. He was right, of course. They absolutely were. The ban lasted 11 days before public outcry forced him to reverse it. You can ban a lot of things, but you can't ban wakefulness once people have tasted it. In Paris, the coffee houses took on a different character. Le Procope, opened in 1686, became the intellectual heart of the Enlightenment. Voltaire drank 40 cups of coffee a day there, or so he claimed. Rousseau plotted his philosophies. Diderot assembled his encyclopedia. The French Revolution, in many ways, was planned in coffee houses where men gathered to imagine a world radically different from the one they inherited. Coffee didn't cause the Enlightenment, but it's hard to imagine the Enlightenment without coffee. The beverage and the era shared a temperament: alert, questioning, unwilling to accept tradition just because it was traditional. The age of reason needed people to be awake enough to reason. By the 18th century, coffee had become so essential to European life that it created a problem: supply. The Ottoman Empire controlled most coffee production, and they weren't interested in sharing their agricultural secrets. Coffee plants were heavily guarded. Exporting live plants or viable seeds was forbidden. But empires are never content to depend on other empires for the things they need. And so began one of history's great botanical heists. In 1616, Dutch traders smuggled a coffee plant out of Yemen. They took it to Java, part of the Dutch East Indies, and established plantations. The Dutch became the primary suppliers of coffee to Europe, breaking the Ottoman monopoly. But the French wanted in. In 1714, the Dutch gave the French a coffee plant as a diplomatic gift. It was installed in the Jardin des Plantes in Paris, where it was guarded, studied, and carefully propagated. Then, in 1723, a French naval officer named Gabriel de Clieu did something either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. He stole a cutting from the Paris plant and took it with him on a ship bound for Martinique, a French colony in the Caribbean. The voyage was a disaster. The ship was attacked by pirates. It nearly capsized in a storm. Fresh water ran so low that de Clio shared his own ration with the coffee plant, keeping it alive while other passengers suffered from thirst. Whether this story is true in every detail doesn't really matter. What matters is that the plant survived, and within 50 years, there were 18 million coffee plants in Martinique. From Martinique, coffee spread throughout the Caribbean and Central and South America. The climate was perfect, the soil was rich, and the colonial powers, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, had access to something that made coffee production extraordinarily profitable: enslaved labor. This is where the story gets darker, and we need to sit with that darkness for a moment. Because coffee, for all its associations with enlightenment and progress and intellectual awakening, was built on the same systems of exploitation that built sugar plantations, tobacco fields, and cotton empires. The vast coffee plantations of Brazil, which by the 19th century was producing most of the world's coffee, ran on enslaved labor. The plants were cultivated by people who would never taste the beverage their labor produced, people whose own wakefulness was stolen to fuel someone else's productivity. There's a bitter irony here. Coffee, the drink that powered revolutions and enlightenment in Europe, was harvested by people trapped in systems that denied them both freedom and rest. The same coffee houses where philosophers debated human rights were filled with coffee picked by people who had none. This contradiction never fully resolved. It just evolved. Slavery was eventually abolished, but coffee production continued to depend on cheap labor, on economic systems that extracted wealth from colonized regions and concentrated it in consuming nations. The wake-up call that coffee provided came at someone else's expense, and yet the demand kept growing, because by the 19th century, coffee wasn't just a luxury anymore, It had become necessary. The Industrial Revolution required it. Imagine you're a factory worker in Manchester in 1850. You wake up before dawn. You walk to a factory where you'll spend the next 12, 14, 16 hours operating machinery that demands constant attention. One moment of drowsiness could cost you a finger, a hand, an arm. The work is repetitive, mind numbing, and absolutely unforgiving. You need to be awake, not just conscious, but alert. Reaction times matter, attention spans matter. The machine doesn't care if you're tired. Coffee became the lubricant of industrial capitalism. Not oil for the machines, but fuel for the humans operating them. Factory owners understood this. Some even provided coffee to workers, recognizing that a caffeinated workforce was more productive, had fewer accidents, made fewer mistakes. The modern work schedule, the 8-hour day, the 9 to 5, the standardized shift, emerged during this period. And it's not a coincidence that this happened at the same time that coffee became cheap and widely available. We restructured time itself around the assumptions of caffeinated consciousness. Before coffee, work followed natural rhythms. Farmers worked when the sun was up, rested when it was down. Artisans worked until the light faded or their bodies demanded rest. But factories ran all day and eventually all night. Machines didn't get tired, humans did. Coffee bridged that gap. The pace of life accelerated. Newspapers, powered by caffeinated journalists, published daily instead of weekly. Trains ran on tighter schedules. Cities grew faster. Ideas spread more quickly. Everything was speeding up, and coffee was the accelerant. Writers and thinkers became famously dependent on it. Honoré de Balzac allegedly drank 50 cups a day, grinding the beans into a paste and eating them when coffee alone wasn't enough. He died at 51, possibly from caffeine-induced heart failure, but not before producing nearly 100 novels. Voltaire, Kant, Beethoven, Kierkegaard, the list of coffee-dependent geniuses is long and illustrious, but genius is just one end of the spectrum. At the other end were millions of ordinary people whose relationship with coffee was less romantic, but no less profound. The shop worker who needed coffee to face another day behind a counter. The mother who needed it to care for children on too little sleep. The student staying up late to study by gaslight. Coffee democratized wakefulness. It didn't matter if you were rich or poor, educated or illiterate, creative or practical. If you drank coffee, you got the same basic effect: more hours, more alertness, more time to be present in a world that increasingly demanded presence. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw coffee transform from a luxury to a necessity, from a drink for the elite to a beverage for everyone. This democratization happened through two developments: improved cultivation methods and, crucially, improved marketing. Coffee companies began to brand themselves: Folgers, Maxwell House. These weren't just products, they were promises: the promise of a good morning, the promise of comfort and routine, the promise that even in a chaotic, industrializing world, some things remained constant. Good to the last drop, promised Maxwell House, a slogan allegedly inspired by Theodore Roosevelt, though the truth of this claim is murky. It doesn't matter. What matters is the implication that coffee is so good you'll want to extract every molecule of pleasure from it, that you'll hold on to the experience until nothing remains. The imagery in coffee advertisements from this era is fascinating. They depicted coffee as both modern and traditional, both a technological achievement and a homey ritual. A woman in a spotless kitchen, smiling as she pours coffee for her husband before he heads off to work. This was the promise that coffee could make industrial capitalism feel like domestic harmony. World War I accelerated coffee's ubiquity. Soldiers needed to stay awake in trenches during night watches before dawn attacks. Coffee rations became standard military issue. Men who had never developed a coffee habit before the war returned home unable to function without it. The government had essentially caffeinated an entire generation. By the 1920s, coffee had become so embedded in American life that it was almost invisible. People drank it without thinking about it, the way they breathed air or drank water. It was just what you did. You woke up, you made coffee, the day began. But something interesting happened in this period of mass consumption. Coffee became boring. Not bad, just boring. Standardized. The major brands were competing on consistency, not quality. Coffee was a commodity, measured in pounds and gallons, not in flavor or origin or craft. For several decades, this was fine. Coffee served its purpose. It woke people up. It tasted adequate. The post war decades of the 1950s and 60s saw instant coffee become enormously popular. You didn't even need to brew it. Just add hot water to freeze dried crystals, and there it was. Coffee flavored wakefulness in 90 seconds. This was the nadir of coffee culture, the moment when coffee became purely functional, stripped of ceremony, reduced to its most basic purpose. It was caffeine delivery, nothing more. But there's a pattern in human culture. Whenever something becomes too standardized, too functional, too stripped of meaning, someone comes along and reinvests it with significance. Someone remembers that things can be beautiful as well as useful, crafted as well as manufactured, particular as well as universal. In coffee's case, that someone was actually a movement, and it started, appropriately enough, in a rainy city where people needed a reason to stay indoors and caffeinated for months at a time. Seattle in the 1970s and 80s was not the tech capital it would become. It was a port city, a bit gray, a bit sleepy, the kind of place where people developed elaborate indoor hobbies to survive the rain. One of those hobbies, it turned out, was coffee. A few small roasters began experimenting with something that had been lost in the mass market era. The idea that coffee beans from different regions tasted different, that roasting was a craft, not just an industrial process, that making coffee could be an art. Starbucks, originally just a bean retailer, opened its first store in 1971. Pete's Coffee was already operating in Berkeley. These weren't the first specialty coffee shops in America, but they were part of a larger movement, later called the second wave of coffee culture, the first wave being the mass adoption of coffee in general, and the second being a return to quality and craft. The second wave said coffee should taste good, not just wake you up, but actually be pleasurable. Beans should be fresh. Water temperature should be controlled. Espresso should be properly extracted. The person making your coffee, the barista, should know what they're doing. This sounds obvious now, but at the time, it was almost revolutionary. For decades, coffee had been a faceless commodity. Now it was becoming personal again, local again, specific again. Then came the third wave. The third wave is harder to date precisely because it wasn't a single event, but a gradual shift in consciousness. Sometime in the 1990s and early 2000s, coffee roasters and cafe owners began treating coffee the way wine enthusiasts treat wine, as a product of terroir, of specific geographic and environmental conditions that produce unique flavors. They started listing the origin of beans, not just Colombian, but from the La Serrania region of Antioquia province, grown at 1,800 meters elevation. They started talking about processing methods, washed versus natural, the effects of fermentation, the importance of drying time. They started doing direct trade with farmers, bypassing traditional importers, building relationships. Baristas became coffee geeks. They debated water chemistry. They calibrated grind size to the nearest micrometer. They competed in latte art competitions, turning the surface of a cappuccino into a canvas. To some people, this all seemed absurdly pretentious, and sometimes it was. There's a fine line between caring about quality and disappearing into such minutiae that you lose sight of the fundamental purpose, making something people enjoy. But at its best, the third wave represented something important. It was a recognition that in a globalized world, specificity matters, that things come from somewhere, made by someone, under particular conditions, that the story behind your cup of coffee, the farmer who grew it, the land it came from, the hands that processed it, is worth knowing. It was also, though participants might not have articulated it this way, a kind of resistance to pure functionality, an insistence that even daily rituals, even mundane necessities like your morning coffee, can be beautiful and meaningful and worth doing well. Today, coffee is both everywhere and nowhere. Everywhere in the sense that it's the world's second most traded commodity after petroleum. Nowhere in the sense that most of us don't really think about it. It's just there, a constant presence like electricity or the internet. The average American drinks about 3 cups a day. Globally, we consume roughly 2 billion cups every day. That's about 166 million cups every hour, about 2.7 million cups every minute. Somewhere, right now, someone is taking their first sip of the day, performing that small ceremony of transformation from sleeper to waker. The coffee industry is worth over $200 billion. It employs roughly 125 million people, most of them in developing nations, most of them earning far less than the people who eventually consume the coffee they produce. This hasn't changed as much as we might like to think. The third wave brought some improvements: direct trade, fair trade certifications, more awareness of supply chains, but coffee remains a commodity produced primarily by poor people for consumption primarily by wealthy people. There's still exploitation in the system. There's still environmental damage. Coffee cultivation has contributed to deforestation in several regions. There are still farmers who can't afford to drink the coffee they grow. But there's also this: coffee has become a global language, a way of connecting across cultures, across borders, across differences. The ritual of sharing coffee appears in almost every culture that has adopted it. It's how you welcome a guest, how you mark an important conversation, how you pause in the middle of a busy day to acknowledge another person's presence. In Ethiopia, where it all began, the coffee ceremony is an elaborate ritual that can take hours. Coffee is roasted, ground, and brewed 3 times, each round with its own name and significance. It's a way of saying you are important enough to spend time with. This moment matters. In Italy, coffee is a social lubricant, consumed quickly while standing at a bar, a brief moment of connection before returning to the day. In Turkey, it's a slower affair, thick and sweet, drunk from tiny cups while reading fortunes in the grounds. In Vietnam, it's served strong with sweetened condensed milk, a legacy of French colonial influence, transformed into something distinctly Vietnamese. Every culture that adopts coffee adapts it, makes it their own, and in doing so, they're participating in a story that's been unfolding for more than 1,000 years. Let's return to where we started, that moment just before dawn when you reach for the kettle. What are you really doing in that moment? On the surface, you're making coffee, boiling water, pouring it over ground beans, waiting for chemistry to work its small magic, transforming solid and liquid into something that's more than the sum of its parts. But symbolically, psychologically, you're doing something more. You're performing a ritual that connects you to centuries of human experience. You're participating in a technology of consciousness that has shaped everything from the Enlightenment to the Industrial Revolution to your own to function before 9 a.m. You're also, whether you realize it or not, benefiting from a global network of cultivation, harvesting, processing, shipping, roasting, and distribution that spans every continent and involves millions of people. That coffee in your cup started as a flower on a tree somewhere, maybe in Colombia, maybe in Ethiopia, maybe in Vietnam. Someone picked the cherries, processed them, dried them, sorted them. Someone bought them, shipped them, roasted them, packaged them. Someone stocked the shelf where you bought them. All of this invisible labor, this vast infrastructure, exists so that you can borrow a few hours of extra wakefulness. Is it worth it? That's not really for me to say, but I think there's something profound about coffee's persistence, about the fact that despite everything, despite its bitter taste, despite its association with exploitation, despite attempts throughout history to ban it or control it or replace it with something else, it endures. Maybe it's because we need what coffee offers, not just the caffeine, though that's important, but the ritual, the pause, the moment of transition between sleep and wakefulness, between the private self and the public self, between dreams and responsibilities. Coffee marks a threshold. It's the thing that stands at the border between rest and action, between unconsciousness and awareness. And perhaps what we're really addicted to isn't the caffeine itself, but that moment of transformation, the feeling of becoming capable, of waking up to the world and to ourselves. There's a question that hovers around any discussion of coffee. Are we better off for it? Did coffee improve human civilization, or did it just accelerate processes that were going to happen anyway? Did it free us, or did it trap us in a cycle of dependence? Did it enhance human consciousness, or did it just extend our working hours so that we could be exploited more efficiently? The answer, probably, is yes, all of the above. History doesn't come with clear moral lessons. Things are simultaneously good and bad, liberating and constraining, beautiful and exploitative. Coffee powered the Enlightenment, but it also powered factories that ground workers down to exhaustion. It funded scientific research and artistic movements, but it also funded slavery and colonialism. It brought people together in coffee houses to exchange ideas, but it also made those ideas possible to conceive in the first place by keeping thinkers awake long enough to have them. You can't separate coffee from the systems it enabled, and you can't separate those systems from coffee. They evolved together, shaped each other, became interdependent. What we can say is this: coffee changed what it means to be human. It changed our relationship with time, with consciousness, with work and rest and social interaction. It gave us access to parts of ourselves that were previously unavailable, hours of the day that were previously dark and dormant. Whether we used those hours wisely is another question. But we used them. We stayed up late writing novels and planning revolutions and solving equations and building businesses and having conversations that changed the world. We woke up early to watch sunrises and start projects and beat the morning rush. We filled those extra hours of wakefulness with everything humans are capable of: beauty and cruelty, brilliance and banality, creation and destruction. Coffee didn't make us better, but it made us more awake, more alert, more capable of sustained attention and effort, more present to the world and to each other, for better and for worse. The science of coffee, such as we understand it, is relatively recent. We've only known about caffeine as a specific molecule since the early 19th century. We've only understood how it works in the brain since the late 20th century. Here's what happens when you drink coffee. Caffeine molecules, which are structurally similar to a neurotransmitter called adenosine, travel through your bloodstream to your brain. Adenosine is what makes you feel tired. It accumulates throughout the day, binding to receptors that slow down neural activity, preparing your body for sleep. Caffeine blocks those receptors. It doesn't provide energy directly. It just prevents the signal that says you're tired from getting through. It's like unplugging the warning light on your dashboard. The car isn't any fuller of gas, but you can't see that it's running low. This is why coffee doesn't actually cure tiredness. It just masks it. And this is why, when caffeine wears off, you often feel more tired than before. The adenosine that's been accumulating all day suddenly floods your receptors all at once. But understanding the mechanism doesn't diminish the magic. If anything, it makes it more remarkable. A simple molecule produced by a plant in response to evolutionary pressures we're still mapping happens to fit perfectly into receptors in the human brain, happens to produce an effect that humans find useful, happens to be contained in seeds that taste good when roasted. It's an accident, a fortunate collision of plant chemistry and human neurology, and yet it shaped history. There are other sources of caffeine, of course. Tea, which actually has a longer history of human use than coffee. Yerba mate in South America, guarana in the Amazon, cacao, which contains some caffeine along with other compounds. But coffee, for whatever reason, maybe the intensity of the effect, maybe the ease of cultivation and preparation, maybe just the timing of when it became widely available, won the competition. It became the world's primary means of artificially extending wakefulness. And now we're so dependent on it that withdrawal is classified as a medical condition. Stop drinking coffee suddenly after regular use, and you'll likely experience headaches, fatigue, irritability, difficulty concentrating. Your body has adapted to constant caffeine intake and needs time to readjust to functioning without it. We've literally rewired our brains around this substance. On a neural level, coffee is no longer external to us. It's part of how we function. If you visit a modern specialty coffee shop, one of those third wave places with exposed brick and Edison bulbs and baristas who take themselves very seriously, you'll notice something interesting. The experience they're selling isn't just coffee, it's a particular aesthetic, a particular mood, a particular relationship to time and attention. These spaces are designed to be what the Italians call a third place. Not home, not work, but somewhere in between. A place where you can exist without a specific purpose, where you can sit with a laptop or a book or just your thoughts, where you're alone but not lonely, private but not isolated. It's not a coincidence that this model of coffeehouse became popular at the same time that work became increasingly digital and disconnected. When your office is wherever you have a laptop, when your colleagues might be scattered across time zones, when going to work no longer means going to a specific physical place, coffee shops become something more than just places to get coffee. They become temporary communities, shared spaces for people who are otherwise atomized. You might not talk to anyone while you're there, but you're not alone. You're surrounded by other people, also working, also reading, also existing in that state of caffeinated productivity that feels somehow more bearable when it's shared. The coffee is almost secondary. What you're really buying is the right to occupy space, to be in a place that's designed for thinking and working and being awake. The coffee is just the admission price. This is different from the historical coffeehouse model, where conversation and social interaction were the primary activities. The modern coffee shop is quieter, more introverted, more focused on individual productivity than collective discourse, but it serves a similar function, creating a space outside the home and outside formal institutions where consciousness can be shared, where wakefulness can be collective, even if the work is solitary. There's a certain type of coffee enthusiast who will tell you that most people are doing it wrong, that your drip coffee maker is inferior to pour over, that your pour over is inferior to AeroPress, that your AeroPress is inferior to some elaborate espresso setup that costs as much as a used car. These people are both right and wrong. They're right that different methods produce different results, that the quality of beans matters, that freshness and grind size and water temperature all affect the final product. They're wrong if they think any of that matters more than whether you enjoy what you're drinking. Because here's the thing about coffee, it's both incredibly simple and infinitely complex. You can spend years learning about bean varieties, roasting profiles, extraction ratios, and still never exhaust the possibilities. Or you can just buy whatever's on sale at the grocery store, make it however you've always made it, and get the same basic effect. Both approaches are valid. Coffee contains multitudes. The obsessives who track every variable in their brewing process are participating in a tradition of craftsmanship and attention to detail that goes back centuries. They're also, whether they realize it, participating in a kind of ritual practice, a way of imposing order and control on at least one small part of a chaotic world. The person who just hits a button on their coffee maker and stumbles back to bed while it brews is participating in a different but equally valid tradition. The pragmatic recognition that coffee is a tool and tools should be easy to use. Neither is more authentic than the other. Coffee has always been both a craft and a commodity, an art and a utility, something worth obsessing over, and something you barely think about. In recent years, there's been a lot of talk about sustainability in coffee production, about fair trade and direct trade, about organic certification and shade grown cultivation, about ensuring that farmers are paid fairly, that ecosystems are preserved, that the true cost of coffee production isn't hidden behind artificially low prices. This conversation is important and it's long overdue, but it's also complicated. The problem is that coffee, by its nature, creates an economic imbalance. It's grown in tropical regions, mostly in developing nations. It's consumed primarily in wealthy nations. The people who need the income from coffee production are negotiating with people who have vastly more economic power. And no amount of feel good marketing changes that fundamental asymmetry. Fair trade certification helps, but it's not a panacea. It ensures minimum prices and prohibits certain practices, but it doesn't fundamentally restructure the relationship between producers and consumers. Direct trade can be better when it's done honestly, but it requires roasters who are willing to invest in long term relationships and pay above market rates. Most don't. The truth is that coffee production remains, in many places, exploitative. Not in the overt way it was during the colonial era, but in the subtler way that any system is exploitative when some people have options and others don't. When farmers sell coffee because it's the only cash crop available to them, when they're price takers rather than price makers, when their children pick beans instead of going to school, the system isn't working for them. Even if the coffee they produce is labeled sustainable and sold at premium prices in hip cafes halfway around the world. This doesn't mean we should stop drinking coffee. That wouldn't help anyone. The solution, if there is one, is more complex. It involves addressing global economic inequality, restructuring trade relationships, investing in producing communities, and recognizing that cheap coffee has always been artificially cheap, subsidized by someone else's poverty. But these are big, structural problems, and they're hard to think about when you're just trying to wake up in the morning, which is perhaps part of the issue. Coffee works so well at making us alert to our immediate needs that it's easy to forget about the larger systems we're participating in. Let's talk about what coffee does to your body because it's stranger than you might think. Within 15 minutes of drinking coffee, caffeine starts to appear in your bloodstream. It peaks after about 45 minutes, then gradually declines, with a half life of roughly 5 hours. That means if you drink a cup of coffee at noon, a quarter of the caffeine is still in your system at 10 p.m. This is why some people can drink coffee at dinner and sleep fine, while others can't have any after 2 p.m. without lying awake at midnight, staring at the ceiling. Caffeine metabolism varies enormously between individuals, controlled largely by genetics. Some people break it down quickly, others not so much. Caffeine affects more than just your sense of alertness. It's a vasoconstrictor, meaning it narrows blood vessels, which is why it can help with certain types of headaches, and why withdrawal often causes headaches, as those vessels suddenly dilate. It stimulates the release of dopamine, which contributes to the mild euphoria some people feel. It increases adrenaline production, which is why your heart might race after too much coffee. Regular use changes your brain chemistry. Your brain responds to constant caffeine intake by producing more adenosine receptors, which means you need more caffeine to achieve the same effect. This is tolerance, and it's why that first cup of the day eventually becomes necessary just to feel normal, not to feel good. In moderate amounts, generally considered to be 3 to 4 cups a day, coffee appears to be relatively harmless and may even have health benefits. Studies have associated moderate coffee consumption with lower risks of certain diseases, though causation is tricky to establish. Maybe coffee is protective, or maybe people who drink moderate amounts of coffee are healthier for other reasons. In large amounts, coffee can cause anxiety, jitters, disrupted sleep, digestive issues, and that particular brand of caffeinated panic where you feel simultaneously wired and exhausted. It's not pleasant. It's also, for most people, not dangerous. Caffeine has a lethal dose, but it's so high that you'd have to try very hard to reach it through coffee consumption alone. What's interesting is how normalized this substance has become. Caffeine is a psychoactive drug. It alters brain chemistry. It creates physical dependence. If it were discovered today, it might not be legal. But because it's been part of human culture for so long, because its effects are generally mild and socially useful, we don't think of it as a drug. We think of it as coffee. There are people who don't drink coffee. They exist. They walk among us, functioning somehow without this crutch that the rest of us have come to depend on. If you're a coffee drinker, these people are fascinating and slightly unsettling. How do they wake up? How do they function? What do they do with their hands during awkward conversations? What excuses do they give for taking breaks at work? Some people don't drink coffee because they don't like the taste, which is fair. Coffee is an acquired taste, and not everyone wants to acquire it. Some don't drink it for religious reasons. Mormons, for instance, abstain from caffeine. Some don't drink it because they're sensitive to caffeine's effects and find them unpleasant. Some just never developed the habit and don't see why they should start. And here's the thing, they're fine. They function perfectly well. They wake up in the morning through some mysterious internal process that coffee drinkers have largely forgotten how to access. They get through their days without chemical assistance. They sleep better, generally, because they're not fighting caffeine's effects on their sleep cycles. From an objective standpoint, not drinking coffee is probably the healthier choice. You're not dependent on a substance. You're not masking tiredness. That's your body's way of telling you that you need rest. You're not spending money on a daily habit. But coffee drinkers don't drink coffee for objective reasons. We drink it because it works, because it's become part of who we are, because the ritual matters as much as the effect, because giving it up would mean admitting that we can't function on our own, which may be true, but it's not something we're eager to confront before we've had our coffee. There's also this. Coffee is a social connector. Not drinking coffee in a coffee drinking culture means constantly explaining yourself, declining invitations, being the person who orders herbal tea in a coffee shop. It's a minor form of nonconformity, but it's noticeable. This isn't to say that everyone should drink coffee, but it does suggest that coffee has become more than just a beverage. It's a cultural marker, a social practice, a shared experience that bonds people together. And opting out of that experience, for whatever reason, means opting out of something larger than just a drink. Coffee dreams exist. People who are trying to quit coffee or who are particularly dependent on it sometimes dream about coffee. They dream about brewing it, drinking it, the smell of it, the comfort of it. They wake up disappointed that it wasn't real. This says something about how deeply coffee has embedded itself in our psyches. It's not just a physical dependency, it's emotional, psychological, almost spiritual. Coffee has become associated with comfort, with routine, with the feeling of being capable and ready to face the world. The morning coffee ritual, in particular, carries enormous psychological weight. For many people, it's the bridge between the private self and the public self. You wake up vulnerable, groggy, not quite formed. You make coffee, and in the time it takes to brew and drink it, you assemble yourself, remember who you are, prepare to interact with others. Take that ritual away, and what's left? You're thrust directly from sleep into the demands of the day without that transitional space, that moment of gentle awakening. It feels abrupt, almost violent. This is why hotel rooms have coffee makers, why offices have coffee machines, why coffee shops are ubiquitous in cities. We've collectively agreed that people need this transitional ritual, this moment of caffeinated becoming. Society is structured around the assumption that people will have access to coffee, that they'll use it to regulate their consciousness and maintain their productivity. What would happen if coffee disappeared? If some blight wiped out all coffee plants, or if climate change made cultivation impossible, or if some future government decided to ban it? Chaos, probably, at least initially. Millions of people going through withdrawals simultaneously, productivity plummeting, a collective grumpiness descending over the caffeinated world. We'd adapt eventually. Humans are adaptable, but there would be a period of adjustment, of learning to function without the crutch we've depended on for so long. But coffee isn't going to disappear. It's too valuable, too embedded, too necessary to too many people. If anything, coffee consumption is increasing globally as developing nations adopt the habits of wealthy nations, as more people join the workforce and need to maintain the alertness that modern work demands. The future, most likely, involves more coffee, not less. Let's imagine a day without coffee. Your day, specifically. You wake up. The alarm sounds, and you silence it, but instead of reaching for your phone and stumbling toward the kitchen, you just lie there, because there's no compelling reason to get up yet. The promise of coffee isn't pulling you forward. Eventually, you do get up, because responsibilities exist whether or not you're caffeinated, but you're slower, foggier. Your brain takes longer to boot up. You go through your morning routine in a daze, waiting for wakefulness to arrive on its own, which it does, but gradually, grudgingly, without the kickstart you're used to. By the time you're ready to start your day, you've lost 30, 40, maybe 60 minutes to this slow emergence. You're awake now, more or less, but you don't feel sharp. You feel like you're operating through a layer of gauze. Work is harder. Concentration requires more effort. Tasks that usually take 20 minutes take 30. You catch yourself staring at your screen without reading what's on it. Your brain keeps wanting to rest, to close your eyes for just a moment, to slip back into the comfortable dimness of half sleep. Around noon, you start to feel more normal. Your body has finally caught up. But then, after lunch, the afternoon crash hits harder than usual. Without coffee to prop you up, your natural circadian rhythms assert themselves. You're tired, actually tired, not just coffee deprived. You struggle through the afternoon. You think about coffee constantly. You imagine its taste, its smell, the feeling of holding a warm cup. You think about how easy it would be to just give in, to brew a pot, to end this experiment. But you don't. You're stubborn, or masochistic, or curious about what lies on the other side of coffee dependence. Evening arrives. You're exhausted, but it's a clean exhaustion, not the wired and tired feeling you sometimes get when you've had too much coffee too late. You eat dinner, you wind down, and when you go to bed, you fall asleep quickly, deeply, without the usual tossing and turning. The next morning, you wake up naturally without an alarm after sleeping 9 hours. You feel rested, genuinely rested, not just less tired, but actually refreshed. Your mind is clear, your body feels good, and you think, maybe I don't need coffee after all. Maybe I've just been masking the effects of insufficient sleep and poor circadian hygiene. Maybe this is what being properly rested feels like. Then you remember that you have a job, responsibilities, a life that doesn't accommodate 9 hours of sleep every night. You remember early meetings, late deadlines, the thousand small demands that require you to be alert before your body naturally wants to be alert. You brew coffee because you live in the real world, and in the real world, coffee isn't optional, it's infrastructure. There's a genre of YouTube video that's become popular in recent years. I quit coffee for 30 days. People document their experience giving up caffeine, filming themselves going through withdrawal, tracking changes in sleep quality, energy levels, mood. The videos usually follow a similar arc. Days 1 through 3 are miserable, headaches, fatigue, irritability. Days 4 through 7 are slightly better but still difficult. By week 2, they're feeling more stable. By week 3, they're claiming they have more energy than ever, that they sleep better, that they don't miss coffee at all. Then, almost invariably, they admit that they've started drinking coffee again. Not every day, they say, just occasionally. Because they missed it. Because it's nice. Because, well, coffee is good. These videos are oddly reassuring. They confirm what most coffee drinkers suspect, that life without coffee is possible, but not necessarily better. That coffee dependency is real, but manageable. That maybe we're not weak for needing coffee, we're just adapted to a particular way of regulating consciousness, and that adaptation is so deep that reversing it requires more effort than it's worth. But they also reveal something else: how much coffee is tied to identity. The people in these videos aren't just quitting a beverage, they're quitting a version of themselves. The caffeinated self, the productive self, the self that can power through fatigue and meet deadlines and stay alert during boring meetings. Giving up coffee means confronting who you are without that chemical support. And for many people, that confrontation is uncomfortable, not because they discover they're worse without coffee, but because they discover how much they've come to rely on it, how thoroughly it's woven into their sense of capability and normalcy. Soon, coffee has inspired an enormous amount of art over the centuries. Paintings of coffee houses, poems about late nights sustained by bitter brews, songs about meeting someone for coffee, about morning rituals, about the jittery edge of too much caffeine. Bach wrote a coffee cantata, a comic mini opera about a father trying to get his daughter to give up coffee. She refuses, singing, "Ah, how sweet coffee tastes, lovelier than 1,000 kisses, sweeter far than muscatel wine." The father threatens to withhold marriage approval unless she quits. She agrees, then secretly adds a clause to her marriage contract. Her future husband must let her drink coffee whenever she wants. This was written in 1735, but it could have been written yesterday. The dynamics are the same: authority figures trying to control coffee consumption, coffee drinkers finding ways around the rules, the recognition that coffee has become non negotiable for those who love it. In literature, coffee shows up constantly as a marker of character and mood. Beatnik poets drinking it in all night diners, noir detectives subsisting on it and cigarettes, students cramming for exams, writers staring at blank pages, measuring time in cups consumed. Balzac famously wrote about coffee. "Coffee is a great power in my life. I have observed its effects on an epic scale." He wasn't exaggerating. His entire career was powered by coffee, sometimes as many as 50 cups a day, which probably contributed to his early death, but also to his prodigious output. There's something romantic about this image: the artist sustained by coffee, producing work that wouldn't be possible without that chemical assistance. But there's also something sad about it: the implication that creativity requires exhaustion, that great work requires pushing your body beyond its natural limits, that art is necessarily linked to self destruction. Modern creativity culture has inherited this belief. The startup founder who brags about working 20-hour days on nothing but coffee, the student who pulls all nighters, fueled by energy drinks, the writer who glorifies their coffee consumption as evidence of dedication. We've confused input with output, effort with achievement. We've convinced ourselves that more hours equals more productivity, that staying awake longer means accomplishing more. And coffee enables this delusion. It lets us override our body's signals, push past natural limits, maintain the fiction that we're machines that can run indefinitely as long as we have the right fuel. But we're not machines. We're biological organisms that need rest, that function better with adequate sleep, that do our best work when we're not exhausted. Coffee can't change that. It can only hide it for a while. In some ways, coffee is the perfect drug for capitalism. It makes you more productive without making you noticeably impaired. It helps you work longer hours without complaining. It's legal, socially acceptable, even encouraged. It's cheap enough that everyone can afford it, but expensive enough that someone profits from it. Coffee keeps the gears turning. It keeps workers awake during night shifts. It keeps students studying instead of sleeping. It keeps soldiers alert during combat. It keeps parents functional despite chronic sleep deprivation. It keeps the economy running at a pace that wouldn't be sustainable without chemical assistance. This is not a conspiracy. No one intentionally designed coffee to serve capitalism. But there's a symbiotic relationship between coffee culture and economic systems that demand constant productivity. They evolved together, shaped each other, became mutually reinforcing. Could modern capitalism exist without coffee? Oh, probably. But it would look different. Work schedules would have to accommodate human biology more. Productivity expectations would be lower. The pace of life would slow. Would that be better? That's a values question, not a factual one. Slower doesn't necessarily mean better, but it might mean more sustainable, more humane, more aligned with what human bodies and brains are actually designed to do. The problem is that we've built our entire civilization on the assumption of caffeinated consciousness. Our work schedules, our economic expectations, our social structures, they're all calibrated to people who have chemical assistance maintaining alertness. Removing coffee from the equation would require restructuring everything. So we don't. We keep drinking it. We accept the dependency, the health effects, the exploitations in the supply chain, because the alternative would require too much change. And honestly, most of us don't want to change. We like coffee. We like how it makes us feel. We like the ritual, the taste, the sense of control it gives us over our own consciousness. There's a moment in the afternoon, around 3 or 4 o'clock, when energy naturally dips. Your attention wanders. Tasks that were manageable in the morning feel insurmountable. You stare at your screen or your desk or whatever work is in front of you, and you think, I need coffee. This is the afternoon coffee run, one of the great rituals of modern work life. You stand up, stretch, maybe ask if anyone else wants anything. You walk to the coffee machine or the cafe down the street. You wait in line. You order. You wait some more. You return with your cup, and just holding it makes you feel better, even before you've taken a sip. Part of this is caffeine, but part of it is the break itself, the physical movement, the brief escape from your desk. Part of it is the anticipation, the knowledge that relief is coming. Part of it is the placebo effect. You expect coffee to help, so it does. This afternoon ritual has been studied by sociologists and anthropologists as an example of how work cultures create informal rhythms and practices that aren't officially sanctioned but are essential to how work actually gets done. The afternoon coffee break is a pressure valve, a way to reset attention, a socially acceptable reason to step away from your work for a few minutes. In some workplaces, this ritual has been formalized. Scandinavian countries have fika, an institutionalized coffee break that's considered essential to workplace culture. It's not just about coffee, it's about social connection, about pausing work to acknowledge that you're human, not just a worker. Other cultures have similar practices. The Spanish have their late afternoon café con leche. The Italians have their post lunch espresso. The Japanese have their canned coffee from vending machines, consumed while standing on the street, because drinking while walking is considered rude. Each culture adapts coffee to its own rhythms and values, but the underlying pattern is the same. Coffee as a punctuation mark in the day, a way of dividing time into manageable chunks, a ritual that marks transitions between different modes of being. What will coffee look like in 50 years? 100 years? Assuming climate change doesn't make cultivation impossible in current growing regions, which is a real concern, coffee will probably continue to evolve in the direction it's been moving, toward greater variety, more attention to quality, more transparency in supply chains. We might see new technologies in brewing, smart coffee makers that adjust extraction based on bean origin, apps that track your caffeine intake and suggest optimal brewing times, subscription services that use AI to predict your preferences and ship accordingly. We might see genetic modification of coffee plants to make them more resistant to disease, more productive, able to grow in new regions. This would be controversial. Coffee purists would object, but it might also be necessary. We might see synthetic caffeine become more sophisticated, with designer molecules that provide the benefits of coffee without the jitters, without the crash, without the dependency. This would fundamentally change the game. Coffee might transition from being a naturally occurring substance we harvest to being a designed experience we manufacture. Or maybe coffee will stay mostly the same because some things are good enough that they don't need improvement. Maybe the basic technology of grinding beans, adding hot water, and waiting is so elegant that no innovation can meaningfully improve it. What seems certain is that coffee consumption will continue to grow globally. China is developing a coffee culture. India is expanding production and consumption. Africa, where coffee originated, is beginning to develop domestic markets rather than exporting everything. As more people worldwide adopt caffeine habits, as work becomes more cognitive and less physical, as sleep becomes an increasingly rare luxury, coffee's role will probably expand rather than diminish. Unless we collectively decide that maybe, just maybe, we should stop chemically overriding our body's signals and instead restructure society to accommodate human biology. But that seems unlikely. Changing coffee culture would be easier than changing work culture, and we're not even doing that. Let's return one more time to that morning moment, to you reaching for the kettle. You fill it with water. You measure out beans or grounds or a pod, depending on your system. You press a button or light a flame. You wait. This waiting is important. It's a moment of suspended time, a pause between sleep and wakefulness, between the person you were when you woke up and the person you'll be once you've had your coffee. In that pause, you're between states, not quite functional, but not quite asleep. And there's something honest about this in between place, something that gets lost once the caffeine kicks in and you slip into productivity mode. Maybe this is why the ritual matters so much, not just because it leads to coffee, but because it creates this transitional space where you can exist without demands, without expectations, without the need to be fully present or fully capable. The smell of brewing coffee is one of the most evocative scents in the world. It triggers memories, anticipation, a sense of comfort. It says, the day is beginning, and you have the tools to meet it. You pour the coffee, you might add milk or sugar or nothing at all. You take that first sip, and something in you settles, aligns, comes into focus, not dramatically, not like a switch being flipped, but gradually, like vision adjusting to light. And then you're ready. Ready for whatever the day requires. Ready to think, to work, to interact, to be the version of yourself that can function in the world. This transformation happens millions of times every morning, all over the world, in apartments and houses and hotel rooms and office break rooms and cafes and train stations and airports. People performing this small ceremony, this daily resurrection, this chemical awakening. We're all in it together, this quiet dependency, this shared ritual that connects us across cultures and continents and every kind of difference that usually divides us. For a moment in the morning, we're all doing the same thing, trying to wake up, trying to be present, trying to meet the day with something resembling readiness. And coffee helps. It's helped for 1,000 years. It'll probably help for 1,000 more. The Ethiopian origin story, the one about Kaldi and his dancing goats, ends with coffee spreading from its place of discovery to the rest of the world. It's a nice ending, neat and satisfying. The gift is shared, everyone benefits. But the real story doesn't end, it keeps going, branching, complicating itself. Coffee spreads, yes, but it carries with it all the complexities of human nature. The good, curiosity, innovation, community, the simple pleasure of a well made cup. The bad, exploitation, environmental damage, the grinding pace of modern life that coffee both enables and requires. You can't separate these threads. They're woven together, inseparable, part of the same story. And maybe that's the most honest thing we can say about coffee. It's not simple. It's not purely good or purely bad. It's a technology that amplifies human capability, for better and worse. It's given us more time to be conscious, and we've used that time to create and destroy, to build and exploit, to think deeply and work ourselves to exhaustion. Coffee is a mirror. It reflects back to us what we value: productivity over rest, alertness over awareness, the ability to keep going over the wisdom to stop. But it also reflects our capacity for ritual, for community, for finding pleasure in small things, for transforming necessity into ceremony. When you drink your coffee tomorrow morning, you're not just drinking a beverage. You're participating in this whole complicated story. You're connected to farmers in Ethiopia or Colombia or Vietnam. You're connected to the Sufi mystics who first learned to stay awake for prayer. You're connected to the Enlightenment thinkers who plotted revolutions in coffee houses. You're connected to the factory workers who needed caffeine to survive their shifts. You're connected to everyone who's ever stood in a kitchen at dawn, waiting for water to boil, preparing to translate themselves from sleep to wakefulness. That's a lot of weight for a simple bean to carry. But coffee has always carried weight beyond its size. It's always been more than it seems. So here's what coffee is: it's a seed from a tree that grows in tropical regions. It's a commodity worth billions of dollars. It's a ritual practiced by millions every morning. It's a social lubricant, a productivity tool, a moment of pause in a hectic day. It's bitter and complex, an acquired taste that becomes essential once acquired. It's also a story about how humans noticed something, experimented with it, adapted it, spread it, and ultimately built entire systems around it. A story about how a simple plant became entangled with human consciousness, with our relationship to time and rest and wakefulness. It's a story about colonialism and capitalism, about exploitation and innovation, about the cost of comfort and the price of convenience. It's a story about monks and merchants, about goatherds and emperors, about farmers and baristas, and everyone in between. And it's your story too. Your relationship with coffee, whatever it is part of this larger narrative. Every cup you drink is a chapter in a book that's been writing itself for centuries and isn't finished yet. The question isn't whether coffee is good or bad, whether we should drink it or quit it, whether it's helped humanity or harmed it. The question is, what do we do with this tool we've inherited? How do we use this power to extend our waking hours? What do we build with this borrowed time? Because that's what coffee gives us, ultimately. Time. Not real time. We all have the same 24 hours, but conscious time. Alert time. Time when we're awake to the world and to ourselves, capable of thought and action and presence. What we do with that time is up to us. The sun is rising now. Somewhere, someone is making their first cup of coffee. The kettle is whistling. The aroma is filling the air. Another day is beginning, powered by the same seeds that have been powering days for longer than anyone can precisely remember. And somewhere else, on a hillside in Ethiopia, or Colombia, or Vietnam, coffee cherries are ripening in the sun. They'll be picked, processed, dried, shipped, roasted, ground, and brewed. They'll become someone's morning ritual, someone's afternoon pick me up, someone's late night fuel for finishing a project that's due tomorrow. The cycle continues. The bean never sleeps, even as it helps us wake. Coffee isn't magic, it's chemistry, agriculture, commerce, culture. But it feels like magic sometimes, doesn't it? That transformation from groggy to alert, from unable to capable, from asleep to awake. Maybe that's enough. Maybe we don't need coffee to be perfect or pure or uncomplicated. Maybe it's enough that it works, that it helps, that it's become part of how we navigate the complex business of being human in a world that demands more from us than we can sometimes give. Maybe it's enough that when you hold a warm cup in your hands, when you take that first sip, when you feel yourself arriving in your own consciousness, you're participating in something larger than yourself, a ritual that spans continents and centuries, a shared human experience of awakening, of choosing to be present, of meeting the day with something approximating readiness. The goats are still dancing somewhere in legend. The monks are still praying through the night. The coffee houses are still filled with conversation and conspiracy. And you're still reaching for that kettle, still performing that small miracle of transformation. Coffee awoke the world, the title says. But maybe it's more accurate to say that the world awoke itself, and coffee was the tool we reached for when we decided that sleep was something we could no longer afford. That consciousness was more valuable than rest. That being awake was worth the cost. Was that decision wise? History doesn't judge, it only records. But every morning, we make that decision again. We choose wakefulness. We choose alertness. We choose coffee. And the world keeps turning, caffeinated and conscious, for better and worse, awake to itself. The kettle is whistling now. Your coffee is ready.